Hi, everyone. Welcome to Journey 39. Today, I'm joined by Ryan Forsyth, and really excited about this conversation. We've had a couple chats. I was on your podcast. We were actually connected by Becca, which was really cool. And I think doing a lot of similar things. And so I'm really excited to dig in more and hear a little bit more about your story. So, if you don't mind starting off, just if you can tell everybody a little bit about yourself. So, what you're doing now, kind of some of the things you've done in the past, just basically everything that got you up to this point, wherever you want to go with it.
Yeah, that is a big question, but I appreciate you having me on. And yeah, shout out to my ginger sister here in Ottawa, Becca, for hooking us up, and got a lot of positive feedback on your episode
Awesome.
as well, that when you came on mine. And you're right. I think we were just joking that we're kind of like long lost brothers in a way, and in a lot of our mindset when it comes to mental health. Where do I start? I'll give you like the Twitter bio, and we can kind of go from there. So I always like to throw in the I'm an award-winning mental health speaker and advocate.
Yep.
I always love to do the award because it just lends to the credibility.
You got it. You got to use it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I have a podcast called Life in Red podcast. It is a podcast that's it's not mental health focused, but a lot of it, obviously, given my network, is part mental health. But really, it's I've had sex workers, astrophysicists, business owners, doctors, nurses, all sorts of different people with a variety of backgrounds. And I usually call it like a guest centered podcast, where I just want to get into interesting things and interesting people and interesting subjects, and just hear different perspectives and thoughts on things from people who are a lot smarter than me. I think that's always important to surround ourselves with that. My day job, I work in radio. So I work for two radio stations here in Ottawa, and I do kind of like contests, events, marketing, communication, social media, like basically everything but talk on the radio and pick the music. And yeah, I've been a mental health advocate since 2015 is usually when I kind of like say my journey started in a way. In the other way, my mental illness started really when I was like 11 or 12 years old. And it started with panic attacks. It started with this, I don't know. I assume you've had anxiety attacks before.
Yep.
Yeah. So I was like an 11-year-old kid lying in my bed at night, and I would remember that one day, like, we have to die. Like, I would just, right, like the inevitability of life. And that would send me into a panic attack. Now, at the time, I didn't know what that was. And for those of you who don't know what a panic attack feels like, it can manifest in all sorts of different ways. But for me, when you go and take that like nice deep breath and you kind of get that soothing feeling throughout your stomach, I would try to do that to like calm down, but I couldn't. And then you start thinking, oh, try it again. You can't do it. And then that's where you start your mind starts racing, like, what's going on? Am I can't breathe? And then you get into this thing where it's like, oh my, am I dying? Am I having a heart attack? Like, I'm 11 years old. How am I having a heart attack? And it just starts to spiral out of control. I didn't know what they were at the time. And, being a kid, I didn't really like think to like tell my parents or anything about it, but that's kind of where it started. And then, we could get into it follow up, but really throughout my teenage years, I kind of started experiencing symptoms of depression. And then when I was 21, I tried to take my life in a transitional period where, I was just finishing up school. I was supposed to start my career, and then all the other social aspects of my life combined with the mental illness manifesting in me. In 2015, like I said, is when I started becoming an advocate, and I shared that story in a little bit more detail on social media for the first time. It was a Bell Let's Talk Day. And I don't really, it was Bell Let's Talk Day has been going on, I don't know, since like 2010 or whenever it started, but there was something about that day in 2015 where I was just really inspired by people sharing their stories. And there's some more prominent figures I saw sharing it at the time. And I was like, you know what? Like, I'm going to just tweet out mine. And it kind of went viral on Twitter. And what I noticed after I did that is not only did I experience a lot of like love and support from friends and family, like you would expect, but even people that like I knew in high school, but I wouldn't even classify as friends. And it was a couple of years since I've seen them, were reaching out. and then complete strangers that were reaching out to me and either lending their support and their love and encouragement to me or sharing their own stories. So at that moment, I kind of realized that being open, being vulnerable, sharing your story, it helps people. And that was kind of like a light bulb moment for me. So, I mean, that's where it all started. That was now what we're going on 7 years ago here in a couple of days. So ever since there, it's kind of just progressed, getting into public speaking, podcasting, doing TV interviews, radio interviews, all sorts of other things like that. So, I mean, we could get into more of that if you'd like, but that's kind of like what brought me to the point of becoming, I guess, a public face. I use, quotation marks, a public face for mental health.
No, thanks for sharing that. And thanks for your vulnerability on that. And, I'm curious, on that day for the Bell Let's Talk Day, do you remember if there were feelings bubbling up before that of like, I kind of want to share this, or I want to talk about it more? Or was it just something about that day and it was just like, you know what, I'm going to do it? Do you remember at all if there was more of a buildup, or if it was just something clicked and you're like, you know what, I'm going to share this?
Yeah, I've always been, I guess not, I've never been like a shy person since I've been in high school. And through that time, without saying it, I was saying it. So I was that person always like quoting like song lyrics in my Facebook status, sharing, memes or like little graphics or pictures and stuff. But I never related that to the personal side of me. So, I mean, you could tell, you're like, oh yeah, Ryan's sad right now because he's posting like this really like depressing lyric.
Yeah.
But for me that day, it really was just seeing other people getting a lot of support. And it was this really like nice feeling. Like I had this nice feeling. I was like, wow, like I think Michael Landsberg was one of the first people I saw sharing it publicly. And there's a few others. I wish I could remember a little clearer, but I was just like, if they can do it, why not me? Why not? Like, I'm already comfortable sharing. I've already been on medication. So a couple people in my life knew I was experiencing mental illness, but no one knew that I tried to take my life. And stupid me, I didn't tell anybody until I made that tweet. So everyone found it out on social media, which in hindsight was not a very smart thing for me to do. But I think that just exhibits that there was something powerful about that moment in that day that just brought me into it, that, I didn't really think as clearly as maybe I should have. But I was kind of like overwhelmed with like, not like a sad emotion, just like I don't know what the word is, but just like wanting to be a part of the community, just wanting to like help people in a different way. And I think subconsciously it was a way to kind of clean a slate for me, that I was like a little bit of therapy and I was like, okay, like it's good to like share this, but I was still carrying that heavy weight of like, this is what I did and nobody knows.
Yeah.
And in a way, I think it was a way for me to kind of like fresh start, if you will, or just clean the slate, or just like just get that weight off my shoulders.
Yeah. And I mean, that makes a ton of sense. And that's, so, it's very similar, but different for my journey of why I even started the podcast, was this idea of, I didn't want to hold these things anymore. I didn't want to keep them in the dark. I didn't want to be afraid of people finding out. And they were just very heavy, like this, I can't really explain it any better than very, very heavy feelings. And so I'm like, you know what, I'm going to do something that scares the living shit out of me, and I'm going to put them out to the world. And, I don't care if one person sees it or if 10,000 see it. For me, just releasing it and putting it out in like public was just so freeing. Like, oh, I don't have to worry about this anymore. I don't have to carry it because I'm not hiding it anymore. It's out there, and, people can know now, people can find out. And whether they know or not, in my mind, I just assume that, oh, well, they know, or if they know, it's not a surprise. I don't have to, worry about them finding out that I struggle with this or that.
Yeah. And it kind of takes away the pressure of like telling each person in your life individually, in a way where it's kind of like, every time you like see a friend or a family member, it's like you have to be like, okay, yeah, like I'm depressed. Like you're just telling everybody at once. And I
Mhm.
think what you said and what I've said and what so many other people have, mentioned on my podcast, or the people I've connected with who experience mental illness and do more public advocacy work, it's that the first time you share something, whatever that is, it can be on social media or on a podcast like us, or it can just be with a friend or a counselor or a mentor, whoever, that moment you finally tell somebody, like, you're right, like it's a hard feeling to describe, but it's heavy. It's like
Yeah.
you're like, you have like kind of like a knot in your stomach, you're kind of stressed about it, you're anxious about it, and you're just kind of carrying around that all the time. But as soon as you kind of tell somebody that first time, it really is, it's freeing. It's like all of that thing, like stuff that you were carrying around, all of a sudden just is gone.
Mhm.
And that's kind of like the one of the things I tell people is, you don't have to tell everybody, you just need to tell somebody. Because
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, especially nowadays, it's like, oh, with social media, or with, I see people advocating for it, like they're all over social media talking about it, or they have a YouTube channel, or whatever it is. And it's like, you don't have to be that, like that's not the
Yeah.
only path. You can just tell somebody individually that cares for you and it's safe, and you'll still get that freeing feeling. You'll still be able to get it off your chest and then start to make those positive steps to getting help and getting better and improving your life.
For sure. And I always remind people that my journey took years to even build up to that. It was, first it was therapy, and, you are contractually obligated not to tell anybody this. So I feel safe to share this with you because I know it's going to be safe. It's going to be, a good environment. I can share it with you. I don't have to worry about, quote unquote repercussions. And then after a couple of years of that, finally, I was able to open up a tiny bit to my sister. And I thought the world was going to come crashing down. It was going to blow her away. And she kind of just brushed it off. It's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I'm like, oh, okay. And then I was able to, start going to groups and sharing with strangers a little bit. And again, like that first time that I did that, heart pounding, sweat on the brow. Like it seemed like, one of the most intense moments of my life. And it was such a tiny thing, but I'd never actually shared that with people that I didn't know. And it became easier and easier and easier. And I think that, like you said, it's so important just to tell somebody. You don't have to come out and tell the whole world all at once, or that it's all you ever talk about, whatever it might be, but just telling somebody and starting that, gives you just as much. Like you can release just as much by telling one person.
And if you want to tell more, that's fine. And if you don't, that's fine.
Yeah.
But it's just that taking that initial step,
Yeah.
to I guess, admit that there's something there, and then want to do something about it to improve your life. It's just as simple as that.
It's something that you said kind of in passing, but I think it is important as well, is, this idea that if you are depressed, or, depression's an easy one, so use that as an example. But, if you're depressed, sometimes it can feel almost overwhelming, feeling like you have to tell everybody, because a lot of times that's now associated, that is your identity, right? Like, oh, Ryan, he's the one that's depressed because, I have to tell everybody, or that's all I think about, or whatever it might be, where it's not your identity, it's a piece of you, but it is not your whole identity. And I feel like a lot of times, even when people start to open up, they can feel a little overwhelmed because that's what they are now identified as. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that, or if you've seen that.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something I work on in therapy a lot, is as somebody who, speaks about it, fundraises, again, public face, that I work actively to not have that as like my sole like purpose, right? Like it's important to me and I love doing it, but like I am not just mental illness. I like sports. Like I said, my job is pretty cool and I like talking about it. I have a podcast, I other things. And I think in today's age, especially with social media, we get into this mindset that, you know, whether it's content creation or, you know, our niches, that when you start speaking about something and whatever that thing is, we get kind of pigeonholed into like thinking that like, oh, well, like this is what I have to do because this is what my audience wants because I just talk about mental health. And I don't think that's the right way, especially when it comes to things like mental illness specifically. Because if you're just surrounded by that all the time and you're not seeking any other forms of balance, you know, it's a heavy subject. It's becomes easier to talk about and you learn more, but it's still not an easy thing to be surrounded by like all the time. You want to seek balances. And I think also the second part of that is we have a sense of really wanting to belong. And that goes for humans in general. And we gravitate towards people who are like us. So you're right that when you start talking about something it's online and social media, that you want it to become your, or you think by making it your sole identity. And whether it's mental illness or whether it's, you know, the sexual orientation that you gravitate to, or, you know, your gender or whatever it is, that by identifying as this, it's easier to become involved with other people who are like you, which is a great thing. And I'm not saying it's not great, because being around people who understand what it's like to be you is it's very powerful. You don't have to explain all those things that, you know, if someone who doesn't understand it, like it's not constantly giving an interview every time, right? It's just easier and you can be yourself. But I think sometimes, and I think a lot of the time for the younger generation, especially, that they think that's the only thing that they can do. And I think I don't I don't personally believe that's always good all of the time. I think it can be part of it, but you're right. It's not something that you should make your entire life and purpose about. It's just a part of you. It's just one of the many aspects that make you you.
For sure. And, you know, even for me personally, I think I ran into this a lot over the past, call it 6 months with my own podcast. I started to lose my why on why I was doing it. And, you know, originally when I started out, it was just having the conversations, sharing, you know, sharing some of my struggles was enough. You know, that gave me enough, that gave me so much value. And as I got more and more comfortable with it, it's like, okay, now I need to put a little bit more intentionality around it. Like, you know, why do I actually want to do this? And one of the things that started to get to me was feeling like I wasn't able to show all of myself. Like, yes, you know, like talking about mental health or personal development or whatever it might be is very important to me and it's a big part of my life. But, you know, I also like to think that I'm funny. You know, I want to show people that, like, that I love goofing around. I love, you know, being silly, making jokes. You know, I love entrepreneurship and, you know, leaning into that a little bit more. And so I had to do a lot of just kind of internal work and conversations with myself of bringing it back to, you know, the why am I doing that? And also it is not my whole identity. Of I do have so much more. And whether or not I publicly go out and talk about it, it doesn't matter as much. And just knowing for myself that I do have those different aspects and not being afraid to show them. And I think that's more of it, not feeling like I need to show those other pieces, but not being afraid to show those other pieces, not feeling like I've been pigeonholed or like I have to be within this box.
Yeah, and I think one of the great things about talking about mental health is, since we all have mental health, you can intertwine that in all of the conversations, especially on a podcast, no matter who you're talking to, whether it's an entrepreneur, whether like you can always ask a question about, you know, explain the mental health around, you know, X, about being an entrepreneur, because that's not easy. You're working long hours, you're stressed. So you can still make that a part of the conversation, but it doesn't, like, it's not, the whole episode isn't just mental health of an entrepreneur, right? And that's, like, you, why, like, my podcast isn't solely based around mental health. There's a lot of aspects, and like I said, I intertwine a lot of it in every episode, but I didn't want to make it all that because, I find science interesting and I want to talk to biologists and, astrophysicists and all these other things that I find cool that I was never quite able to comprehend in school, or, talk to business owner. Like I said, like, it's just creating variety of interests, I think, is just, it completes you, and it also benefits your mental health in the end.
For sure.
And I think, a lot of people say, you need to find your niche. What is your podcast about? It needs to have a niche. It needs to have an audience. And I kind of look at it like, why can't general interest be a niche? Because
Yeah.
I like general interest stuff. I just like learning about things. And I've always said that, there's 7 billion people or whatever there is on the planet. And if 5 billion people hate my podcast, doesn't have a niche, it still gives me, 2 billion plus that may like it because they like general interest. And I don't love the niche culture. I understand it from a growth perspective and as a marketer, but as a human, I'm not a huge fan because we're so much more than one thing.
For sure. And I follow Gary Vee a ton, and one of the things that he says is, the niche is you. The niche is Jared, that you're going to have your own take. You're going to have your own interests. You're going to have your own questions that you want to ask. Like, you are your own niche. You don't have to niche down any more than that, because your unique perspective, experiences, questions, and very similar to what you're saying of like, okay, from a marketing standpoint, it might be more difficult or harder to understand, but there's going to be so many people that like it just because they like you, or it's similar things that they want to go about. Like you said, there's 7 billion people. A couple of them must have the similar interests as you, right? Which,
and go ahead.
No, you go first.
I was going to say, I think that's more of the future of content creation, is, personality is you. And you're right. Like, we are niches. Now it is hard to convince other people to buy into one person, right? Because there's so many people and so many people putting out content. So it presents a very unique challenge. But I think, and this is me coming from my media background in radio, that people want, we came from like the early and mid 2000s of this point of like, influencer culture, and it was beautiful people doing beautiful things, and that's really cool to look at, and we can kind of like aspire to be them, or like just dream of what it would be like to be a Kardashian for a day. But I think now, and it's been accelerated by the pandemic, is we're craving authenticity, where we want people who give their unique perspectives and thoughts and ideas, and shows empathy and humility and, compassion. Like, I think that's the future of where we're going with all these conversations about niches and content. And we see it every day in radio that, people want to relate to the announcers. And they want to feel like they know you. And we're seeing that now with TikTok as opposed to Instagram, where it's like famous creators on that platform are drawing people in because, sure, they have funny videos, or maybe they do skits, or maybe they do dances, but they also bring you in with other real parts of their life, where it's like, maybe it's mental illness, maybe it's their relationship, maybe it's their career, like whatever it is, they bring you more intimately in, which presents other challenges, but at the same time, it gives you an opportunity to really cultivate an audience that is loyal and passionate for you, as opposed to just, liking because you have a really nice butt. Like, you know what I mean? So it's interesting to see where it will go for sure.
For sure. I think people are really craving that. They want to see the whole, excuse me, the whole picture, and not, not a filtered view of it. And, that's, I think, one of the reasons why I resonate so much with you is, going back to mental health. And what I've also has helped, kind of bring me back is I felt like, especially people talking about men's mental health or mental health in general, it seemed like there was a very specific type of person, right? Of like, you have to be like this, or it has to show up like this. And either, especially when it comes to men, what I've kind of seen is on one side, you have the very like almost guru, like very spiritual, very flowy monk-like person. Or on the other side, you have like the very almost like hyper masculine, like, unleash your manhood. We're going to go, just scream in each other's faces and like let that aggression out. And I felt like there wasn't any real in between. And so, even going back to that conversation of it doesn't have to be your whole identity, and, showing that, one of a tiny thing is you can still be competitive, right? Like, I can talk about mental health. I can talk about, my struggles and my own depression and, excuse me, all of those different kind of struggles. And I can still go out, play sports, be super competitive. Like, it's not, again, trying to get away from just placing people in those boxes. Like, no, this is what you have to look like. This is what it is to be quote unquote like healthy, or not to be, not to be a toxic masculine guy, whatever it might be. And so I just think that it's so important that we're having those full conversations. I think you're one of the people that is also doing that in your own way.
Well, thank you. That's what I try to do. And I like to break the idea of like what makes, like when we talk about toxic masculinity, like what makes it toxic? Why would people classify it as that? And what it really comes down to is, are you harming yourself and other people in the way that you are presenting yourself? And that usually comes to presenting yourself as a man. So things like, hyper aggression, being misogynistic or racist, or homophobic or transphobic, whatever that is. You're creating an environment which people do not feel safe. That's what makes something toxic. It's not any inherent idea of being a man. So whether that, like you said, comes down to being very spiritual, or whether you're hyper masculine in a sense that it's like, go to the gym, grind, start my business and work 24 hours a day. None of that is inherently evil. It's just when you are hurting yourself or hurting other people. So what I like to do with this, and when I talk to other men or I give a presentation on mental health, is my idea is that there's no perfect way to be a man. And I like to borrow from everything. Like I like to embrace my more spiritual side and examining things like energy and purpose and all the, I don't really meditate, but things like that, where there's more to life than just these things that are in front of us, these tangible things that we can touch. There's lots more going on there. But I also like to borrow aspects from grinding and, like you said, being competitive. I'm extremely competitive, but what I've learned to do is tailor that competitiveness into a way where I'm not screaming at my teammates anymore. I'm not, yelling or smashing my hockey stick, or like dragging other people down. It's more of a leadership where you're trying to like bring other people up with you to trying to win. And you can translate that from sports to your business life, to surrounding yourself with people who just match with your values, and you guys kind of like empower each other as a group to be better in life. But I also believe in that, like, as competitive as I am, and as I'm busy as I am with whether it's my podcast or mental health or my job or whatever, that it's also important to find balance, and take time for myself and explore nature and, do the things that are going to be important to my mental health. I still like lifting heavy. I still like working out. I still like flirting with women, all those things. But when you narrow it all down, nothing, again, is inherently evil or an awful thing to embrace. But what we need to do is bring empathy, compassion, understanding, active listening, all those things into our lives, as well as seeking help for our own shortcomings. Because if you're just going to the gym to mask your mental health struggles, it might feel good in that moment, but you're still not addressing the root issue. So it's still always going to be there. So it's important to, make sure you're comfortable being vulnerable. Make sure you're comfortable removing yourself from the center of a conversation. And I think that's trouble that a lot of men have. It doesn't mean you can't have an opinion on a certain subject, but sometimes it's about not inserting ourselves, or sometimes it's being a part of something without trying to be at the front,
Interesting. Yeah.
making sure those voices that need to be heard, especially when it comes to things like, indigenous movements or Black movements or, women's movements, that sometimes it doesn't warrant ourselves trying to center ourselves in those conversations. Sometimes it's just better to stand at the back and just support the people we love. And, it's having respect for our fellow human beings, right? Maybe we don't all agree. There's certainly lots of things that, are very controversial right now. And it's going to take a lot of unpacking and a lot of time to do. But that doesn't mean that maybe because you don't believe in something that you're inherently a bad person. Sometimes it just takes time on learning some of the things that you've learned your whole life. And it's just, again, leading with empathy and compassion and taking care of your own self mentally to make sure that you are in a headspace which you can do all these things I just kind of mentioned in a healthy and safe way.
Yeah, no, I love everything that you said there. And, for me, I think of it very similarly, where I go, what are your intentions behind the actions? It's not so much the actions themselves, but what are the intentions behind it? Like, again, with the gym thing, are you going to the gym because you like it, because it makes you feel good, because, it's, physically and mentally good for you? Or do you actually have severe body image issues and you're trying to mask those? Or like you said, you're struggling with mental health and, you go there to escape it, right? Even like for me, one that I really struggled with is the idea of like grinding, because my whole life I've always really enjoyed work, and I've always worked extremely hard and extremely, long hours of, call me a workaholic, is probably fair. What I didn't realize is most of it was to actually mask my emotions. If I was so busy and I just didn't have any literal time to think about anything, or, actually give time to the things that I was struggling with, I could mask those. That, along with trying to gain approval from other people. Going back to it now and realizing those things about myself, it was a 2-year process really of me, again, almost testing, okay, do I actually like working and, entrepreneurship and building things, or was I doing it to mask them? And it was a little bit of both. And so removing the more unhealthy driving factors, and then going into, am I able to motivate myself and do it because I want to, and because I actually believe in this, or I really do want to achieve it for myself, was a very tough journey for me. And like I said, one that I'm actually just coming out of now. And I think that was huge what you said too, of men removing themselves from the center of the conversation, because I haven't thought of it like that before. And I feel like a lot of times we're told that you need to lead the charge, that you need to take control, you need to be there, you need to be the one to do whatever it is. And it can be so tough to, like you said, take that step back, support almost from the sidelines. Support the ones that you love, or people that you care about, or causes that you want to support from the sidelines, and not need to be the center of attention, is so difficult for so many of us, I think.
Yeah, it's an idea that, and don't get me wrong, it didn't come naturally to me either. And especially as somebody who's always kind of been involved in advocating and activism, sometimes it feels good to be the leader. Sometimes it feels good to have people say nice things, but I think you're right, that we are conditioned in a way that we have to be, the leader, the strong one, the vocal one. And I'm not saying that's always a bad thing. It's just context. You always need to be like context. So in a conversation where we're talking about, let's say, Indigenous sovereignty, and, we had over the last year, all those children's remains found, and we have a lot of Indigenous people speaking about what they would like. And, sometimes the conversation comes about, white people and the things that we have done as a race and as a humanity and as a country and as a culture. And it's really easy to become defensive with that, because you think, I sat here I've never said anything bad about, people. I've always tried to be a good person. And now I have people saying like, oh, white people are awful, or men are, even more specific example when it comes to men. When you look at social media, especially around the movements, all men should die, men are awful, men are trash, all these things. Like, right. It's really easy to become defensive when you look at it as an individual, being like, I'm a good person. I've done all these great things. I've never been racist. I've never, touched a woman inappropriately. Why are they calling me trash? It's something I've struggled with. And, just, I think even going back to the conversation on mental health, it's talking about it in a safe environment, but not only talking, but like actively listening. So they're not calling you specifically trash, and you get into that conversation of men piping in with well, not all men are trash, and then that just starts a whole other thing. But you need to remember that it's not personal. It's not really about you. We love to make things about us as an individual. It's not really about you. And if you're a good person and you believe that you've done good things and that you support these movements, like, just don't make it about you, because it's not about you. Let other people talk about their experiences just like you talk about your experience. And you don't need to refute it. You don't need to argue with it. You don't need to be like, well, actually, or blah, blah, whatever it is, because that's not your conversation. Talk to your friends about it if you want, but you don't need to go on social media or in, a speech or a march and try to like impose yourself on what's being talked about. Just, again, talk about it with your friends, talk about it with your partner, your parents, or whoever. Talk about it in your head and work through it. Your therapist, even better. But we love to, and it's a human thing, we just love to make things about ourselves because that's the way we see the world. And in reality, as sometimes it's not as nice to say, it really, not a lot is about us as an individual. We're wonderful, we're unique, we're lovely, but in collective movements, it's not, it's not about us.
For sure. And, a lot of times I really try to take, the stand of not convincing people. Like, I'm not going to try to convince people. I'm going to, put out thoughts. I'm going to bring up conversations. I'm going to have conversations, but I'm not going to try to fight with somebody to convince them, to show them how they're wrong, or to show them how I'm right, or whatever it might be. Because I think that really adds to like, almost to call it team dynamics. You're on my team, you're not on my team. You're with me or you're against me, right? And I think that's really where a lot of those conversations can go awry, is because there isn't the acceptance of gray. There isn't the acceptance of, well, I can have thoughts on this, and I can be on maybe neither side, or just because I'm not going about it exactly the way that you are, doesn't mean that I don't care about it. Doesn't mean that I'm not also trying to support it in the best that I can. And, a really interesting one that we've talked about a couple of times is, especially, like, call it as two white, cisgendered straight males. I personally have been either implicitly or explicitly basically told that either, all of these issues are your fault, or you shouldn't have an opinion, or you don't deserve to have a voice. And, I think that, like you said, can lead to a lot of defensiveness, because I think that it's a lot of people are told, a similar story. And I know that you've had some similar experiences as that. And I'm just wondering if you could expand on some of those, and maybe some of your experiences and some of your thoughts around it.
Yeah. You're right. We do get that a lot because we're kind of at the top of the hierarchy. And I understand that. And one of the things we need to understand when it comes to any sort of movement, activism, advocate, is it's coming from a place of trauma or like oppression.
Mm-hmm.
So when people are trying to change something, it's because it's bad, right? Like it's poor results for these people. So sometimes the way I look at it is when I see things like that, I'm like, you know, again, we go to empathy. It's one, you can't put yourself in other people's shoes. I will never understand what it feels like to be called a slur or have racism or violence towards me. Now, what I will say is I went to the Cancel Canada Day March with my family because I have siblings who are Indigenous. And as we were walking in the march, it was a peaceful march, and it was just to raise kind of like awareness for the children, Kamloops and all those places. We were walking past the Supreme Court of Canada, and there was an anti-lockdown protest. The People Party of Canada were there, and there was a lot of people who were kind of protesting that. Now, as we were marching by, some of them, not all of them, came towards the street and were yelling really awful things, being very violent. There were people arguing and fighting. And as I was walking by and people were shouting, I was holding my 6-year-old sister's hand, and I was walking with my 11-year-old brother. And my 6-year-old sister grabbed my hand really tight and came into me very timidly. And my 11-year-old brother was like, "Why are they yelling those things at us?" And I didn't know how to answer. And I overcame with emotion. I kind of am now, because I like, how do you tell an 11-year-old and a 6-year-old that these people hate you because of your skin or your culture? And I wept, and I was just overcome with emotion. And that was the closest thing I've ever come to just seeing a result of like overt racism out there. And I think that's what's important to remember about all these things. And especially as white men, like, how is what we did as a culture, and how do we do now, even when we are trying to offer our defenses or offer alternative perspectives, right? It affects women, it affects children, it affects all sorts of different aspects of it. Even though we are not the ones who officially colonized Canada, what happened deeply impacts generations upon generations of people. And I did an episode on my podcast in the summer with a friend who studies kind of like the effects of stress and intergenerational trauma on the body, and how that really manifests. And there's like intergenerational trauma sound like people are like, oh yeah, whatever, but like they're like, it impacts your DNA and your cells, the things that happen to your grandparents and your parents. All those things gets carried on to you as a child. And like, that's what there's so much we don't know about what has been done to, whether it's Indigenous people or Black people or trans people or gay people or women or whoever. And whether it's us or not, like, you have to understand that like there have been deeply traumatic things that have happened. And by you trying to interject yourself and maybe speak over or whatever, like, whether your intentions are good or not, you are creating a lot of harm, and you're not helping. As much as you think you might be, it's not helping. And that's why I say we need to remove ourselves from those larger conversations. And it's better to actively listen to what they're saying, rather than trying to be like, nah, well, it might be better. Like, I don't agree that calling, all men are trash and calling them out are going to make it a safer environment for women. I think it actually does the opposite, in a way that it actually creates more resistance and creates more resentment on men. Now, that's on men. That's not on women. That's on men to deal with. But at the same time, human nature, again, we just become defensive and become more resistant to certain things. But all of that to say, that's why I believe that just don't say anything. It doesn't warrant me offering opinion. Is more about me than it is about the general conversation of what's happening. And that's what I think is important to remember.
For sure. And I think I shared this on the episode I did on your podcast. For myself, what helped me really kind of wrap my head around it was, two ways of thinking. The one is just because you didn't experience it doesn't mean it's not true. And that one for sure impacted me a lot. And the second one was acknowledging somebody else's trauma doesn't take anything away from yours. It's not a zero-sum game where it's like, well, I had it worse than you, or, well, no, you sharing that with me, I've also had it tough, and so it's accepting that, and whether or not the other person accepts it, really just having that conversation with you, that yes, you can acknowledge their pain, you can acknowledge their suffering, you can acknowledge their trauma, and that doesn't take away from your own. You can still
mental illness and trauma are not competitions.
No,
we all are unique and have had unique things happen to us. When we're talking about groups and collective people, other people have had it a lot worse on a collective level. That doesn't mean you didn't have it rough, or the things that happened to you didn't matter. And that's you're right. Like, that's just so important to always put into context, that just because this thing's going on doesn't mean that, if you're sexually assaulted, that happened and I'm sorry. And but like, it doesn't mean because women or whatever, I love that point. It's so important that this isn't a competition. We're not racing for the Olympics of who has it worse here. We can all acknowledge that we've all had struggles and hardships, and some people have had a lot more than others, right? Like, one of the things in my speeches I always say is like, I have mental illness and I've never really experienced anything like super traumatic in my life. Like, I've had it really, really good. I've had a super privileged and lovely life for the most part. But that doesn't take away that I still struggle with mental illness, and struggle with suicide ideation and all those things. So it's just a great point for people to remember.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I think there's a lot of judgment too on, again, whether explicit or implicit, of, well, you shouldn't feel that way because it wasn't that bad, right? Or other people have it so much worse. And similar for me, of, I wouldn't call it any, super quote unquote traumatic events happening in my life. Yes, there was a couple, but they weren't centered around me necessarily. There were, I was part of the situation, right? And for me, it was more, kind of the day in, day out stress, and just, the way that I was born and the way that I took things on. I took on a lot of emotional responsibility, always being super empathetic and taking on other people's emotions. Growing up in the household that I did, a lot of that transferred over, but I almost felt like I wasn't worthy of struggling. I'm like, well, other people have gone through this, I haven't gone through something like that. One of, call it the big 4 traumatic events that we usually point to. So I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't struggle with it. And it showed up very differently of, hearing you talk about having panic attacks at 11. And I was like, that's really interesting, because I didn't start experiencing my panic attacks until I was quite a bit older. Like, I would call it probably around 24. And, just thinking about it for the first time here, if I went, my life was a lot more stressful, a lot more traumatic when I was younger, but how come I didn't have those panic attacks, and how come they started presenting themselves later on? And it was interesting, literally in this conversation, I went, I was still in fight or flight mode my entire life. It was very much like survival mode for me my entire life, of I have to lock down a lot of these emotions. I have to lock down a lot of these feelings because I need to make it through. And it wasn't until I actually started digging those up and working on them and becoming conscious to them, that I would find myself in a situation that I no longer wanted to be in. And I knew that I didn't want to be in it. And my body went, no, like, we're not going to be here. We're going to shut down, basically. And there's the panic attack. I think the first one that I remember, I was actually at like a networking event, and I didn't want to be there. It was, there's a lot of surrounding circumstances, but, it wasn't quote unquote unsafe. It wasn't super traumatic, anything like that, but it wasn't the event itself. It was, years and years and years of being put into situations, into environments that I didn't want to be in. And finally, my body just being like, no, like, we don't want to be here. We've had enough, kind of thing.
Yeah. And that's stigma, right? That's why we all struggle. And it's so important to remember that, you know, there are internal and external factors that affect your mental health and your well-being. We all experience mental health, and just because you don't have a diagnosed mental illness doesn't mean you cannot experience depression or anxiety or other sort of mental health struggles. Which makes it mental illness is like the chronicness of it, the never going away, or sort of like there aren't really a lot of external factors that have happened. And I think a lot of people get into the mindset of like what you said is that, like, I've never been like assaulted, I've never been abused, I've never been homeless. And we hear a lot of those stories from people, especially, in the media and larger conversations around mental health and illness. And those people are extremely brave for going through what they've been through and coming out and now trying to inspire others. But I think it's a lot more relatable for people to just be like, I don't know, man, like I'm sad and I can't explain to you why I'm super sad,
Yeah.
but I'm sad and I don't want to be here. I think that is more of a universal experience. And sometimes it's nothing we can really do. It's just the chemicals in our brain that just aren't firing properly, right? Like my mom, my grandmother, my great grandmother, my great great grandmother, like it just got passed through. And lucky me, I'm the one who inherited it. That's just the luck of the draw for me. But it's interesting that you say, like, I think one of the biggest things I've learned on my podcast and talking to people with, especially like extreme mental illnesses, like
Mm.
dissociative identity disorder, or for people who don't know, multiple personality, or borderline personality disorder, or bipolar, that like what happens to us as kids, and going back to that conversation even about intergenerational trauma, but especially as kids, how much that can affect us later in life. Like it is truly scary how something that you might not even consciously really register,
Yeah.
like you're going to carry that forward, and it can make a huge impact in your adult life, whether that be mental health wise, or whether that just be body image, or
Yeah.
self-conscious, confidence, ego, what have you. But especially when it comes to mental illness, and especially the more severe things that happen, like it's scary. And it just goes to show you that like how important schools are and how important parenting is, and how you can never truly take any of that stuff for granted, because it's going to make such a huge impact for you as an adult. I think that's kind of like what we're seeing now, why the world is a little bit chaotic,
Yeah.
is and mental health wasn't part of the conversation. So now you have a lot of people in charge in all facets of society who, they just might have stuff going on. And now we're kind of leading the world into, not such a great path. So if there's anything people should really focus on, it's like mental health of kids and
Yeah.
young teens, youth. And that's something I really believe in too.
For sure. And it's something that I've realized more and more and more. And even, going off my own experiences is, and I've shared, multiple times of, the decisions that I made in junior high school that guided my entire life, because, not remembering that they were actually decisions that I had made and they weren't truths, and they were in there so long and, so deep rooted. It's like, no, that's just the way it is. And then looking back on them, digging some of them up, being like, oh, you know what? I don't think that anymore. It's not a truth. Another interesting one for myself. And, I don't blame my mom for this. I know that it was coming from a good place, but it was when I moved schools in elementary. I remember in grade 2, I was getting bullied a lot. And her, her advice to me was, oh, they just want to be your friend. Right. And, again, coming from a good place of, her just wanting me to fit in. However, it registering in my brain as, oh, if people like me, they're going to treat me poorly, and carrying that throughout my entire life. And again, it's such minor things, or, maybe offhanded comments can have such huge impacts, because as kids, we're just sponges. We're taking everything in, like we're internalizing all of that. And, that's, for me personally, at least, one thing that I've really leaned into is, one of the best ways to kind of stop that chain of intergenerational trauma is to work on yourself. because you're not, if you can work on yourself and pass on less of those traumas into, might not even be your kids, but even just children or people that you then interact with in your life. And one of the reasons why it's so important to me for people, and for myself to do this work is because it has such a, so much more of an effect and a ripple effect that you can even imagine.
We are more connected than we all realize. Like every kind of like individual action, no matter almost how big or how small, kind of like has ripple effects through like everything. And you're so right. And I believe it too, that like if we all took the time to really work on ourselves and work on, our emotional intelligence, being mindful, being able to take steps back and just really like deeply think about things before we sort of like act, that like it just, that creates a ripple effect too of just, again, like you said, less things being passed on. It's because if you are like chirping people anonymously on the internet, like that's going to have a huge ripple effect.
Yeah.
So I think that's super important that you mentioned that we really take the time to work on ourselves. And listen, it's not always going to be perfect. We're still going to make mistakes. And it's important to be easy on yourself when you do. We still are human. Sometimes we're going to get angry and maybe blow up. We can't all be like stoics in certain times. And especially now with what the world's happening, like it's a lot to take on. So sometimes you're just having a really shitty day and someone sends you a nasty email and you're just like crack your knuckles and just go off. But I think the more that we can really like take a step back and really just kind of make everything a little bit better in our own lives, that like we just in time we have less of it. And then it just becomes like the intergenerational trauma does, but like then it starts to get passed down because then the next person in line, has less shit they're dealing with. And then hopefully they can work on themselves and then, like, and so on and so forth. And you just hopefully create such a more mindful and emotionally intelligent and healthier society.
For sure. And, like removing that idea that you have to be perfect, that you always have to respond perfectly or whatever it might be. And, I think the other thing too, is you might not see that direct result. It might not be like, oh, but I was nice to this person and they were, still an ass to me, right? Like, you don't know if that might be the seed of them several years later, working on themselves or, changing their ideas or whatever it might be. One final thing that I wanted to touch on, which is, in the same vein, I think is, especially for, I know that you touch on a lot of, call them polarizing topics, just with kind of the nature of the conversations that you have and, receiving hate or negative feedback or whatever it might be on social media. I'm just curious if you could expand a little bit on that because I think we all get negative comments, of all different kinds, whether we're touching on, those types of topics or not. We get negative feedback or, people just saying nasty things, whatever it might be, and maybe just some of your experiences with it, and why you keep having the tough conversations and going into the tough topics. And just, how you deal with those types of comments.
When it was 2018, it was kind of like the height of the Me Too movement in a way. I was dissecting a lot of like cultural conversations on Twitter. So I was just similar to everything we've kind of talked about, just really angry people just going off on each other. And like that's how I was learning to interpret the world and these really difficult subjects, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's sexuality, whatever. And, I was becoming that defensive guy that was just being like, I'm again, just like I said, like, I'm that great person. I've raised all this money for mental health. Why are you calling me this and that? And they weren't even, it wasn't directed at me. They were just talking about it in general. But I was like sitting there being like, what the hell? And just like we were talking about. And it took a moment, I became like obsessed. And even if you listen to earlier conversations of when I started my podcast and I think it was 2018, like 3 years ago, you could tell there was things like, why is Ryan bringing that up? Like, it's not even like part of the conversation. That's weird. But it's because I was so obsessed and like anyone who would listen, I'd be talking about these things. And it took my ex-girlfriend at the time literally asking me, why are you so obsessed with this? And it was like a snap. I was like, holy shit, like
Yeah.
I am. And I was able to like start to unpack that therapy, talking about like have a much healthier relationship with everything. So coming from that and learning how obsessed I was getting with these ideas and these critically important conversations, like that's what kind of led me to wanting to start the podcast in the first place. Is I was like, I can't be learning about this stuff on social media because I'm not getting the whole picture. I'm not getting all the context. You know, it's just angry people lashing out at each other. It's like, I want to be able to have these conversations because I know I'm a good person. I know I'm compassionate. I know I'm empathetic. So it's not going to be confrontational, even if we might disagree on things. But like, I need to have these in a better way because I'm curious. I need to know. I want to be better. I want to be the best person that I can be for everybody around me. And I need, like, it's so important to me to be able to have these conversations in a safe environment. And so it's really through the podcast where I was able to start to like, okay, like, listen, like people are a lot more rational and understanding when you're talking to them, as opposed to like people just throwing stuff out on social media, right? It's really easy to just like get into things and getting into arguments and you're never really solving it. But when you're talking to somebody, it's a lot easier to be like, okay, so why, you know, what is white privilege as a good example? Oh, okay, yeah, you're right. So you're not saying that white people have it easy. You're just saying that they don't have it bad because they're white. Oh, okay, that makes so much more sense. Or something like defund the police, right? You see that, you're like, wow, what do you mean? Like, and then it's like, oh no, like it's like you still have police, you just allocate resources into better. Oh, okay, right. It's just so much easier to dissect and have a conversation about. But you're right. When you talk about things that are a little more heated, I guess, I don't think they're heated. I think they're just very human, but people are extremely passionate about them, whether it's talking about toxic masculinity or talking about trans issues or Black Lives Matter or, you know, Indigenous, whatever it is. People, for whatever reason, get very passionate on one side or the other. And for me, it's listen, those conversations are not going away and you can pretend to be blind and ignorant to them. But they're happening and change is coming and I want to be a part of that change. So that's part of it. Now for the hate, you know, some days I deal with it better than others. You know, even just a video the other day that was posted on a platform that I work with. People were calling me gay and, you know, I was talking about toxic masculinity and I was wearing a pink shirt in the video and yeah, just people chirping me. And again, it's not always easy. And like I'll say yesterday was actually, I had an incident with that was going on. And then I had an incident at work that really kind of set me off. So yesterday wasn't a great day. But one of the quotes I always go back to is people are going to love you. People are going to hate you. And neither of it has anything to do with you, right? It's, I can do as much as I can, raise millions of dollars and try to help as many people. And there's still going to be people who are going to say negative things. And I just always try to remind myself that, you know, that's on them. It's they're projecting on me for some sort of insecurity, or maybe they have a bad job or a failing marriage or their kids hate them or whatever it is. Like they're hurting and they're lashing out. So that's one thing. And I never engage. If it's personal attacks, I never engage. Sometimes I like to bait anti-vaxxers on TikTok just to get views, but those aren't personal, right? Like they're arguing with me about vaccines and calling me a sheep or whatever. Like that's fine. I find that funny. But like if it's a personal attack or the personal attack on my work or my ideas like that, if it's thoughtful, I'll respond. But if it's just people being like wieners, like I don't engage. It's like, okay, again, that's on them. And like unfortunately, like sometimes I'll maybe offer a compassionate comment like, hey, I'm here to help or I'm here to listen if you have things you want to talk about. I try not to do that too often because sometimes it comes across as condescending, which doesn't help either. But defending myself or arguing with people on social media, like it's never going to help. Like people aren't going to change their mind because someone on TikTok, like, or Twitter, like argued. Like it's kind of like futile. But hopefully, maybe I can have a conversation on the podcast about it and try to get a different perspective on things and really think about it. So again, not always as easy said or done as I say it, but excuse me, that's kind of like the mindset I try to go into things with.
For sure. And, thanks for sharing that. And I think it's a really tough thing just in general, and so easy to get sucked into those, I'm going to show you, or even if it's coming from a good place originally, it can change so fast. I'm like, oh, I'm going to, show this person like, what I was actually thinking or whatever it might have been. But another thing that I think is important is you're talking about some of those earlier episodes where you'd bring things up and there were specific topics that you were going to talk about no matter what. And still having those and showing people your progression. Because I think a lot of times we try to erase, if we think that we, either did something wrong or if we weren't the best version of ourselves or whatever it might be, and erase those paths. Like, oh, I don't want people to see me like that because I'm now like this. But showing people again and almost removing that perfection piece of it. You don't always have to be perfect. You can learn, you can change, you can elevate, you can grow, whatever it might be, instead of trying to get rid of it and hide it.
Yeah. And I thought about that. Like I never said anything like horrible, but one thing that I was definitely arguing was the idea of white privilege. That was something I would argue about. And I thought about deleting some of the episodes, but you're right. I wasn't being overtly racist. I was being dumb and ignorant for sure. But since then, like I've always prepared. I've never really had too many comments about it, but I've always prepared. I was like, look, yeah, you're right. And I'm sorry. Here's a conversation that I had with this person that really like we get into it. And like that was like a big turning point for me. So like listen to that before you judge. But you're right. Like I was I was just dumb 20-year-old, like a mid 20-year-old guy who was listening to Joe Rogan at the time and getting some pretty shitty ideas about life. And for that, I am sorry. But here's the things that I've tried to do since then to be better and amplify other voices and just learn. But I definitely don't hide the fact that I'm willing to openly talk about it, just as if, someone who maybe was in like a KKK who's come out of it now talking about it to hopefully make people better, or who went to jail and now is an advocate, like whatever it is, right? Like if you can talk about things openly and then like talk about the change, I think that is relatable to a lot of people, especially when it's subtle things like those things. I was just like white privilege is the biggest example. Is just like I was just dumb, uneducated, and ignorant, but I did the work and continue to do the work and still learning and still growing and still trying to be better. But yeah, you're right. Like I don't want to hide it, as scary as that can be, because we know the internet can sometimes be unforgiving. I think it'll help more people than it hurts.
For sure. And I think it removes some of that maybe unconscious shame that people feel of like, oh, I hear all these people and they're so much more knowledgeable than me, or they're so much farther ahead than me. And so, I'm going to hide and not ask questions because I'm so far, behind. And I was like, no, we all start somewhere, and you can't get somewhere if you don't start, if you don't take that first step. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. We are running out of time here, but I'm just curious if there was anything that we didn't get to that you wanted to talk about or ask or bring up or anything like that.
I don't think so. I think this is a very lovely conversation. If people want to check out my podcast, that would be lovely. It's Life in Red podcast. It's available everywhere. Life in Red Pod on Twitter, Life in Red Podcast, Facebook, Instagram, and lifeinredpodcast.com. I'm at 131 episodes, I think. And more to come in 2022.
Awesome.
Including an episode with you, by the way. People should check out and learn more about you on the other side of the mic.
That'd be great. I feel like I don't, I have people ask me a lot. They're like, do one where we learn more about you. I'm like, oh, that's why I go on other people's.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll make sure I link all those. I'll link all your socials. So if people want to follow you or get in touch with you, they can do so there. But yeah, just amazing conversation. So thankful for it. Glad that we got connected. And yeah, just glad that you're out there doing the work that you're doing.
Same to you, man. It's been great connecting with you, and I love knowing that there's other people who kind of like share a vision of healthier, better men, and is doing the work to try to like help other people get there. I think it's super important. So I appreciate this opportunity, and I appreciate you.